I spent Christmas in a freezing truck with a man I just met. Then he said something that made me want to stay. Riley Garrett was driving her Kenworth T680 westbound on Interstate 80 through Iowa at 9:45 on Christmas Eve, watching the weather go from bad to actively dangerous in the span of about 15 minutes. And the CB radio was lighting up with chatter from other truckers, all saying the same thing. Visibility was dropping fast and the highway patrol was about to shut down the entire corridor. 32 years old, independent long-haul freight driver specializing in heavy industrial equipment, and she'd been on this route hauling a 30-foot CNC machine from Cleveland to Omaha for the last 11 hours. And normally, she loved the solitude of the cab and the steady diesel rumble under her feet, but right now she was white-knuckling the wheel, trying to see past her hood. She'd volunteered for this Christmas run because the pay was double time, and she didn't have family obligations or kids waiting at home. Just a one-bedroom apartment in Kansas City that she saw maybe 8 days a month, and honestly, she preferred the rhythm of the road to sitting around pretending to be festive. The blizzard had been forecast, but not like this. The Weather Service had called for moderate snow and some wind. Nobody had predicted whiteout conditions and wind gusts strong enough to rock her 70,000-pound rig and rip the steering wheel sideways in her hands. The CB crackled again, and a voice with a heavy Oklahoma accent said, "They're closing 80 at the junction. State Patrol's got the barricades up. If you're between mile markers 240 and 260, you need to find somewhere to park it now." Riley checked her GPS and she was at mile marker 253, which put her right in the dead zone with nowhere to go. And she could barely see the white lines on the pavement anymore through the horizontal snow. She'd been through bad weather before, had driven through ice storms and blinding rain, and one memorable hailstorm in Nebraska that had cracked her windshield. But this was different. This was the kind of whiteout where you couldn't tell if you were still on the road or drifting into the median. Her headlights just reflected back off the snow, making visibility worse, and she was doing maybe 20 miles per hour with her hazards on, hoping nothing rear-ended her trailer. A green highway sign emerged from the white for maybe 2 seconds before disappearing, and Riley caught enough of it to read "Way Station 1 mile," and she made a split-second decision to take it because sitting in an empty way station was better than sitting on the shoulder of an interstate where someone could plow into her. She found the exit ramp more by feel than by sight and crept down it, and the way station came into view as this dark, blocky shape with no lights on, and it was clearly closed for the holiday, but it had a large paved lot and a small cinder block building that might provide some shelter. Riley maneuvered her rig into the lot and set her air brakes with that distinctive hiss-thunk sound, and she killed the engine to conserve fuel because she had no idea how long she'd be stuck here. The cab went quiet except for the howl of wind battering the truck, and she pulled on her heavy Carhartt jacket and her insulated gloves and grabbed her go bag that had emergency supplies. Flashlight, some road flares, and the jar of peanut butter she kept for situations exactly like this, where she might be stranded without access to real food. She climbed down from the cab and the wind hit her like a physical force, snow stinging her face and the temperature feeling like it was in the single digits, and she fought her way across the parking lot to the cinder block building that housed the way station office. The main door was locked, but Riley walked around to the side and found a service entrance that had been left unsecured, and she shouldered it open, stumbling inside and pushing it closed behind her against the wind. The interior was pitch black and freezing, not much warmer than outside, and Riley pulled out her flashlight and swept it across the space. Standard way station setup, couple of desks with old computers, filing cabinets, a small bathroom in the back, and concrete floors with those industrial ceiling tiles that did absolutely nothing for insulation. The power was clearly out. No emergency lighting, no heat, just darkness and the sound of wind rattling the windows. Riley was about to set down her bag and start figuring out a plan when her flashlight beam caught movement in the corner, and she swung it over fast and saw a man sitting on a metal folding chair with his own flashlight pointed at the floor. "Power grid failed about an hour ago. Backup generator's got a busted fuel line. Won't start," the man said, his voice calm and matter-of-fact like they were discussing the weather instead of being stranded in a blizzard. "Got here about 20 minutes before you. Same idea about shelter." He was wearing a heavy orange DOT jacket with reflective strips and insulated work pants, boots that were caked with snow, and he had a thermos sitting next to him on the floor. "I've got half a thermos of black coffee left and a bag of pretzels in my truck. Close the door all the way. You're letting the wind in." Riley pushed the door until the latch caught and set her bag down on one of the desks. "I'm Riley. I was trying to make it to the junction before they closed the interstate, but the visibility went to hell. Figured an empty way station was better than the shoulder." She walked over and the man angled his flashlight so she could see his face. Mid-30s probably. Needed a shave, had the kind of permanent squint that came from years of staring into headlights and snow glare. "What's your situation? You stuck here too, or did you pull in for shelter?" "Silas, I run plow for the county DOT. We've got a mutual aid contract with Iowa DOT for major weather events. So I was out clearing the westbound lanes when my hydraulic line blew on the main blade assembly. Had to limp into this lot before the system failed completely," he said, and he gestured toward the back of the building where Riley could see the dark shape of a massive snowplow through the window. "Called dispatch, but they've got operators stranded all over the county. I'm low priority until they get the main routes cleared. Could be 6 hours, could be 12, depending on when this storm breaks." He unscrewed his thermos and took a drink of what was presumably coffee, and then offered it to Riley. "You want some? It's still warm?" "Barely." Riley took the thermos and sipped, and it was terrible coffee. Overbrewed and bitter. But it was warm and caffeinated, and that's all that mattered. "I've got 3 road flares in my bag and a jar of peanut butter." "Looks like a party," Riley said, and Silas's mouth twitched into what might have been a smile. "Road flares, that's actually smart thinking. We could use one as a heat source if we can find something metal to contain it. Don't want to burn down the only shelter we've got." He stood up and Riley noticed he was tall, probably 6'2", and he moved with the deliberate care of someone whose body was sore from physical work. They spent the next 20 minutes doing a systematic search of the building by flashlight and found a metal trash can that would work for containing a flare, some old paperwork they could use as kindling if needed, and in the bathroom there was a small window that had been left partially open, which explained why the building was so cold. "I've got duct tape in my emergency kit. Let me grab it," Silas said, and he went back outside briefly to retrieve supplies from his plow, returning with tape and a space blanket, and he sealed the window completely. Riley pulled out her flashlight and they agreed to save the road flares for emergency signals, only since burning them indoors was too dangerous, and instead they sat in the cold darkness, conserving body heat, though the building was too uninsulated to stay in much longer. "This building's too cold and we can't risk burning flares indoors for the fumes. We need to find better shelter," Riley said, and she sat down on the concrete floor with her back against the wall because there were only 2 chairs and standing felt like a waste of energy. Silas sat down a few feet away and stretched his legs out, and they sat in the darkness with only their flashlights, listening to the storm batter the building. "You do this route regular or just taking the holiday pay?" Silas asked, and Riley kept her gloves on, flexing her fingers against the cold. "Both. I run Cleveland to the West Coast pretty regularly. Industrial equipment mostly, CNC machines, fabrication tools, stuff that's too heavy for standard freight. And yeah, I volunteer for the holiday runs because the pay's better and I don't have anywhere else to be," Riley said, and she pulled out her jar of peanut butter and a plastic spoon she kept in her bag. "You want some? It's not exactly a Christmas dinner, but it's calories." Silas took the jar and ate a spoonful before passing it back, and they traded it back and forth in the cold darkness. "I've been running plow for the county for 8 years. Before that, I did highway construction. I like the winter work because it's straightforward. You clear the road, salt it, move to the next section." "No ambiguity," Silas said, and he was using his multi-tool to pry open a panel on one of the desks, looking for anything useful. "I take the holiday shifts because the guys with kids should be home, and I'd rather be out here doing something productive than sitting in my apartment watching other people's Christmas lights." He found a box of stale crackers in the desk and held them up like a prize, and they added those to their meager food supply. Around 11:30, the cold had become unbearable, and they'd migrated closer together near the center of the room, sitting maybe 3 feet apart trying to conserve warmth. but the concrete was pulling heat from their bodies faster than they could generate it. "Worst haul you've ever done? What's the story?" Silas asked, and Riley thought about it while she ate another spoonful of peanut butter. "2 years ago, I was hauling an industrial press from Detroit to Sacramento. Thing weighed 45,000 pounds, and I hit black ice in Wyoming and jackknifed on the interstate. Didn't flip, but came damn close. Spent 4 hours in a ditch waiting for a heavy wrecker in negative 20-degree weather. That was pretty bad." Silas nodded like this was a completely reasonable story. "Worst storm I ever plowed was 3 years back. Ice storm hit the entire county in January. We were out for 72 hours straight. I fell asleep at a red light twice. Another operator crashed his plow into a guardrail because he'd been awake for 40 hours. It was a disaster." They kept trading stories like this. The worst loads and the worst weather, and the weirdest things they'd seen on the road. And somewhere around 1 in the morning, Riley realized she was more comfortable talking to this stranger in a freezing way station than she'd been in most social situations in the last year. Silas checked the temperature gauge on his watch and showed it to Riley. "It's negative 12 outside. This building's going to turn into an icebox without any heat source. Concrete doesn't retain warmth, it just absorbs cold. We need to move somewhere with better insulation." Riley knew he was right, could already feel the cold seeping up through the floor into her legs, and she looked at him. "My truck's got a sleeper cab. It's insulated for long hauls. Engine's off to save fuel, but it'll hold heat better than this cinder block box." Silas stood and offered her his hand to pull her up. "That works. We grab whatever supplies we can carry and make a run for it before the visibility gets any worse." They gathered everything useful: the road flares, the food, their flashlights, and Silas's emergency kit from his plow, and then they braced themselves at the door. Riley pulled it open, and the wind immediately tried to rip it off its hinges, and they fought their way across the parking lot to her Kenworth, snow hitting them from every direction, and the cold so intense it hurt to breathe. Riley climbed up first and unlocked the cab, and Silas followed her up, and they pulled the door closed behind them, and the sudden absence of wind was almost shocking. The sleeper cab was small, maybe 6 feet by 7 feet, with a narrow bunk and some storage cabinets, and it was cold but noticeably warmer than outside. Riley pulled out her heavy thermal sleeping bag and spread it across the bunk, and they sat on opposite ends, catching their breath and brushing snow off their clothes, and through the windshield they could see nothing but white, the storm showing no signs of letting up anytime soon. The sleeper cab of Riley's Kenworth was designed for one person to live in for weeks at a time, which meant fitting 2 full-grown adults in the space required some strategic arrangement of limbs and gear, and for the first 20 minutes, they sat on opposite ends of the narrow bunk with their backs against the walls, trying to give each other as much space as the 7-foot width would allow. The temperature inside the cab was probably hovering around 30 degrees, and without the engine running to power the sleeper heater. They were essentially sitting in an insulated box that was slowly equalizing with the negative 12-degree air outside. Riley had her thermal sleeping bag partially unrolled between them, and Silas had his heavy DOT coat zipped up to his chin, and they'd both removed their boots to improve circulation and wrap their feet in Silas's emergency space blanket to prevent frostbite, tucking them up on the bunk away from the cold cab floor. The wind was hammering the truck hard enough that Riley could feel the whole rig rocking slightly on its suspension, and through the windshield the world was just white, no distinction between ground and sky, just this overwhelming blank wall of snow that showed no signs of stopping. The dashboard clock read 1:35 a.m., which meant they'd been stranded for almost 4 hours, and the CB radio was still crackling, with occasional transmissions from other truckers calling out their positions and status. "You run solo full-time, or do you work for a company?" Silas asked, and he was digging through his emergency kit, pulling out items and taking inventory, a habit Riley recognized from her own obsessive preparation routines. "Independent owner-operator, bought this rig 4 years ago. I contract with freight brokers for loads, but I'm not on anyone's payroll. More risk but better money, and I get to pick my routes," Riley said. And she was doing her own inventory check, mentally calculating how much fuel she had left and how long she could run the engine if it became absolutely necessary. "You own your plow, or does the county provide equipment?" "County owns the truck and the equipment. I just operate it. They pay hourly plus overtime, and it's union, so the benefits are decent. Been doing it long enough that I'm senior operator, which means I get first pick of routes and shifts, Silas said. And he pulled out a second emergency blanket from his kit, one of those space blankets that was basically metallic plastic, and he unfolded it and draped it over his legs. Not as glamorous as running your own business, but it's steady work and the pension's solid if I make it another 17 years without wrapping a plow around a telephone pole. Riley pulled her knees up to her chest, trying to conserve body heat, and she could feel the cold starting to seep through her jeans despite the insulated cab walls. You ever think about doing something else? Getting a job that doesn't involve being awake all night in blizzard conditions? She asked it casually, but she was genuinely curious because in her experience, people who did this kind of work either loved it or were trapped by circumstances. And Silas didn't strike her as someone who'd feel trapped. He thought about it for a minute before answering, unwrapping one of the stale crackers they'd salvaged and eating it slowly. I like the work because it's simple. Roads are either clear or they're not. You can see the direct result of what you're doing, and the night shifts mean I don't have to deal with traffic or office politics or any of that social performance stuff that exhausts me, Silas said, and he gestured at the whiteout beyond the windshield. Plus, there's something satisfying about being the person who makes it possible for everyone else to get where they need to go, even if they never think about who cleared the road for them. Riley understood that completely, had felt the same way about freight hauling. This idea that she was part of the invisible infrastructure that kept society running while most people were asleep or completely unaware. They talked for the next hour about the mechanics of their respective jobs, and Riley explained the complexity of securing a 40,000-pound load so it didn't shift during transport, the math of weight distribution, and the specific tension requirements for different types of cargo. And Silas described the physics of snow removal, how you had to angle the blade differently for wet snow versus powder, how salt worked at different temperatures, and why sand was better below a certain threshold. It was the kind of technical conversation that would have bored most people to tears, but they were both fully engaged, asking detailed questions and comparing notes on equipment and techniques. Around 2:30 a.m., Riley checked the thermometer she kept velcroed to the sleeper wall, and the temperature inside the cab had dropped to 26 degrees, and she could feel it in her fingers and toes. This creeping numbness that meant her body was starting to pull blood away from her extremities to protect her core. Silas had noticed too. She could see him flexing his hands inside his gloves, trying to keep circulation going, and when he spoke again, his voice had an edge of concern that hadn't been there before. We need to do something about the heat situation. 26 is manageable, but it's only going to get colder. And if we're stuck here until morning, we're looking at another 5 or 6 hours minimum. Riley knew he was right, knew that hypothermia was a real risk if they just sat here slowly freezing. But her options were limited. I could run the engine for heat, but I'm sitting at a quarter tank of fuel, and with snow drifting up around the truck the way it is, the exhaust could get buried, and we'd have carbon monoxide building in the cab before we'd notice it. Silas nodded, clearly understanding the problem, and he was looking around the sleeper cab like he was trying to find a solution in the limited resources they had. The sleeping bag is rated for what temperature? He asked, and Riley pulled the tag to check. 0 degrees, but that's designed for one person in an enclosed sleeping situation. We're in a ventilated cab with 2 people and inadequate insulation. Silas was quiet for a minute, and Riley could see him doing calculations. And when he spoke again, his voice was careful, like he was aware this was going to be awkward but necessary. Most effective way to prevent hypothermia with limited resources is shared body heat under insulation. We pool our thermal output and reduce the total surface area exposed to cold. It's basic thermodynamics. Riley felt her independent streak immediately want to reject that idea because this truck was her personal space, her home on the road, and she wasn't used to sharing it with anyone, let alone a stranger she'd met 4 hours ago. But the rational part of her brain that had kept her alive through multiple bad situations knew Silas was right. You're talking about both of us getting in the sleeping bag, she said flatly, wanting to make sure they were on the same page about what he was suggesting, and Silas met her eyes directly. I'm talking about survival, not making a move on you. We get inside the bag together, but keep a layer between us. and we use proximity to generate warmth. I can sleep sitting up against the wall if that's more comfortable." They rearranged the sleeping bag and both climbed inside, Riley positioning herself on the inside against the cab wall, while Silas stayed on the outer edge, and they both kept their base layers on, but removed their bulky coats to allow better heat transfer, using the coats as additional insulation layered over the top of the sleeping bag. The immediate difference was noticeable. Riley could feel warmth radiating from Silas, even through the layers of insulation, and the sleeping bag was trapping their combined body heat instead of letting it dissipate into the cold cab. It was awkward, and neither of them really knew where to put their arms, and they ended up in this weird configuration where Riley had her back partially against the wall, and Silas was sitting with his legs stretched out and his arms crossed over his chest. "This is the most uncomfortable I've been in a situation that's keeping me alive," Riley said after a few minutes of adjusting positions, and Silas made a sound that might have been a laugh. "Yeah, this is not how I pictured spending Christmas Eve when I clocked in yesterday morning. But I've been in worse situations with worse company. At least you're not trying to tell me your life story or asking personal questions." Riley appreciated that more than he probably knew, appreciated that they could just exist in this forced proximity without either of them trying to make it into something emotional or dramatic. Around 3:15 a.m., the temperature outside had dropped to -15, according to Silas's watch, and Riley could hear the wind starting to die down slightly, which might mean the storm was finally easing, or might just be a temporary lull. They'd been quiet for about 20 minutes, both conserving energy and warmth, when Silas spoke again, and his voice was lower, more contemplative. "I usually volunteer for the holiday shifts so the guys with families can go home. Dispatch knows I'll take Christmas and New Year's and Thanksgiving. But honestly, sitting here right now is the best Christmas I've had in about a decade, which probably says something sad about my life, but there it is." Riley turned her head to look at him, and in the dim light from the dashboard, she could see his expression was serious. "Better than the peanut butter?" she asked, and Silas smiled for real this time. "Marginally better than the peanut butter. Jury's still out on whether it beats the stale crackers." They fell back into silence, and Riley found herself actually relaxed despite the circumstances, despite being stranded in a blizzard with a stranger. And she realized it had been a long time since she'd felt comfortable enough around another person to just be quiet without it feeling tense. The hours crawled by, and they dozed off and on, never fully asleep because the cold wouldn't allow it, but managing short periods of rest. And every time Riley woke up, she'd check the thermometer and the clock and the view through the windshield. Around 5:30 a.m., the snow finally started to ease, the whiteout conditions breaking into just heavy snowfall, and by 6:15 she could actually see the outline of the way station building and Silas's plow parked behind it. The CB radio crackled to life with a transmission from State Highway Patrol saying they were starting to clear the interstate with heavy equipment, estimated reopening by 9 a.m. for emergency vehicles and commercial traffic. Riley and Silas extracted themselves from the sleeping bag arrangement and spent a few minutes getting circulation back into their limbs, and the temperature in the cab had stabilized at around 28 degrees, which was cold but manageable now that they knew rescue was coming. Silas pulled on his gloves and grabbed his flashlight. "I'm going to check on my plow, see if I can jury-rig the hydraulic line enough to at least move it out of the lot. You good here?" Riley nodded and started organizing her gear, and Silas climbed down from the cab and trudged through the snow toward his vehicle. She watched him go and felt this weird sense of loss at the absence of his presence, which was ridiculous because she'd spent the entire night with a stranger out of necessity, not choice. But there was something about the way they'd navigated the situation together that felt significant in a way she couldn't quite articulate. The sun was starting to come up, weak winter light filtering through the clouds, and Christmas morning was breaking over a landscape buried in 3 feet of snow. Christmas morning broke over Iowa in that particular way winter storms do. The sky shifting from solid gray to this pale, washed-out blue, and the sun coming up over 3 feet of fresh snow made everything so bright, Riley had to squint even through the tinted windshield of her Kenworth. She'd been watching Silas work on his plow for the last 20 minutes from her driver's seat, and he'd managed to get the engine running, but the hydraulic blade was still non-functional, locked in the down position, which meant he couldn't drive it on public roads without scraping asphalt. The CB radio had been steady with traffic from other operators checking in, and the State Highway Patrol had just announced they'd cleared the westbound lanes of Interstate 80 from the junction east, which meant Riley's route was technically open if she could get her rig back onto the highway. She climbed down from the cab and walked over to where Silas was crouched next to the plow's hydraulic assembly, and the snow came up past her knees in some places where the drifts had piled against the way station building. Silas looked up when he heard her approaching, and there was hydraulic fluid on his hands despite the cold, and his expression was frustrated in that specific way mechanics get when a fix isn't working. Line's completely blown. I can get the engine to turn over, but the blade system's shot. I called dispatch and they're sending a wrecker. But it's going to be a few hours. They've got equipment scattered across 4 counties, Silas said, and he stood up, wiping his hands on a shop rag that was already soaked with fluid. State Patrol just opened the westbound lanes. I need to get this load to Omaha and park it before the next storm hits tomorrow night. You going to be okay here waiting for the wrecker? Riley asked. And she genuinely wanted to know, because leaving someone stranded went against every trucker code she operated by. But she also had contractual obligations and a narrow time frame. Silas nodded and pulled off his work gloves to check his phone. Yeah, I'm good. Dispatch knows where I am. Wrecker's got my coordinates, and the sun's out, so I'm not going to freeze. You should get moving while the roads are clear. They're calling for another system to move in tomorrow night. They stood there in the bright morning light, and the situation felt suddenly awkward in a way it hadn't during the night. Like now that survival wasn't the immediate priority, neither of them knew quite how to acknowledge what had happened. Riley shifted her weight and looked at her truck. Thanks for the thermodynamics lesson. The shared body heat thing probably kept us from getting frostbite. I appreciate you not being weird about it. Silas made that almost laugh sound again. Thanks for having an insulated sleeper cab and being willing to share it. Also for the peanut butter. That was clutch. Silas walked back toward his plow, and Riley figured that was it. They'd survived a blizzard together, and now they'd go back to their separate lives, ships passing and all that. But then he stopped and turned around. He pulled a piece of paper from the clipboard mounted in his plow cab, one of those dispatch sheets that was already covered in grease stains and coffee rings, and he used a pencil to write something on the back. He walked back over and handed it to Riley, and she could see a phone number and what looked like a CB radio channel written in blocky print. I'm off shift on Tuesdays. If your route brings you back through this county ever, let me buy you a dinner that doesn't come from a vending machine, Silas said, and he had his hands shoved in his coat pockets, and his expression was completely neutral, just offering information with no pressure attached. Riley looked at the paper and then at him, and something about the way he'd phrased it as a conditional instead of a demand made her want to say yes. It's a deal, but I'm driving. I don't ride passenger in anything smaller than a semi, Riley said, and she folded the paper carefully and put it in her jacket pocket. Fair enough. I've seen how you handle that rig. I trust your driving more than most people's anyway, Silas said, and he stepped back so Riley could make her way to her truck. She climbed up into the cab and started the engine, and the diesel fired up with that familiar rumble that meant everything was still working, despite sitting in negative temperatures all night. She let it warm up for a few minutes while she did her pre-trip checks, and through the windshield she could see Silas back at his plow working on the hydraulic assembly, even though he'd already said it was hopeless. Riley pulled out of the way station lot carefully. The snow was deep enough that she had to take it slow, and she got back onto the entrance ramp for Interstate 80 westbound, and the highway had been plowed down to bare pavement in the travel lanes with massive walls of snow piled on the shoulders. The road was almost empty, just a few other commercial vehicles and some emergency response trucks. And Riley settled into her driving rhythm, the familiar weight of the trailer behind her and the road stretching out ahead. She made it to Omaha by 4 p.m. on Christmas Day and parked at the fabrication plant's lot. And when the receiving manager arrived early the next morning, he was surprised anyone had made it through given the storm. But Riley just shrugged and said she'd found a place to wait it out. The return trip to Kansas City was uneventful, and she spent the next 3 weeks running her usual routes: Cleveland to Portland, Chicago to Phoenix, the steady rhythm of loading and unloading, and highway miles. The piece of paper with Silas's number stayed in her jacket pocket, and she'd pull it out sometimes at truck stops, looking at the numbers in the CB channel, but she didn't call because she wasn't sure what the protocol was for following up on a connection made during a survival situation. Mid-January, she picked up a load heading from Chicago to Denver, and the route took her right through that same section of Interstate 80 in Iowa. And when she passed the exit for the way station, where they'd been stranded, she made a decision. She grabbed her CB radio handset and switched to the channel Silas had written down, and keyed the mic. "This is westbound KW hauling steel to Denver, looking for a county snowplow operator who knows anything about thermodynamics. You out there?" She let go of the transmit button and waited, and for about 30 seconds there was just static. Then the radio crackled and Silas's voice came through, slightly distorted but recognizable. "This is County DOT Unit 7. I know a little bit about heat transfer. What's your 20? Riley smiled and checked her GPS. "Westbound 80-mile marker 245, just past the way station where I spent Christmas Eve eating stale crackers with some guy. You know the place?" There was a pause, and then Silas came back on. "Copy that. I'm about 15 miles ahead of you, clearing the eastbound lanes. There's a truck stop at exit 230. Meet you there in 15 minutes? Riley confirmed and pushed her rig a little faster. And when she pulled into the truck stop, Silas's plow was already parked in the commercial vehicle area, and he was standing next to it in his orange DOT jacket, looking exactly like he had on Christmas Eve, except less covered in snow. She parked her Kenworth and climbed down, and they met in the middle of the parking lot. "You're actually back through this county. Thought maybe you were just being polite when you took my number," Silas said, and Riley shrugged. "I run this route every 2 to 3 weeks, depending on loads. Figured I'd see if you were serious about that dinner invitation. Though I should warn you, I've only got about an hour before I need to get back on the road." They ended up in the truck stop diner eating mediocre hamburgers and drinking coffee that was only slightly better than what Silas had been carrying in his thermos. And they talked about the last 3 weeks, the loads Riley had hauled and the storms Silas had plowed through. And it felt easy in the same way it felt easy sitting in her sleeper cab at 3 in the morning. When Riley had to leave to make her delivery window, Silas walked her back to her truck. "So 3-week rotation, that puts you back through here early February. Same deal, truck stop dinner whenever your route allows?" Silas asked, and Riley nodded. "Yeah, I can work with that. Plus you've got my CB channel now. If our routes cross, you can reach me on channel 19. That became their routine. Riley would run her route, and when she came through Iowa, they'd meet for whatever meal fit her schedule. And in between, they'd talk on the CB radio, these long rambling conversations about everything and nothing while she drove west, and he cleared roads going east. 3 months in, Riley's route got adjusted, and she started coming through twice a week, and Silas would coordinate his meal breaks to match her schedule. 6 months in, they'd progressed from truck stop diners to Silas cooking dinner at his apartment on the nights Riley could lay over in the area. And she'd started keeping some of her personal gear at his place because it was easier than living entirely out of her sleeper cab. 1 year later, Christmas Eve came around again, and Riley was westbound on Interstate 80 hauling a load of manufacturing equipment, and she could see the familiar orange strobes of Silas's county snowplow on the parallel county road, keeping pace about a quarter mile to her right. The CB radio crackled and Silas's voice came through clear. "Westbound KW, you planning to stop anytime soon, or am I going to be plowing this county road solo all night?" Riley smiled and keyed her mic. "County Unit 7, there's a rest area in 12 miles. You buying coffee?" Silas came back immediately. "Only if you're buying the pie. I know you've got that delivery bonus burning a hole in your wallet." If this story felt real to you, if you've ever learned that the strongest connections aren't built through grand gestures, but through showing up when things get difficult, stick around for more stories like this, and tell us in the comments if you've ever met someone in the most unexpected place imaginable. Sometimes the people who change your life don't arrive during the easy stretches of the journey. Riley thought she preferred the road alone, and Silas thought Christmas Eve would be just another shift in the snow. Instead, one storm brought them to the same place at the same time and showed them that the best partnerships aren't about rescuing each other. They're about finding someone willing to weather the storm beside you and keep driving when the road finally opens again.